that lasted 335 years and had no casualties. Imagine a war that lasted longer than the United States has existed. A war so long it spanned generations, revolutions, and the rise and fall of empires, yet never spilled a single drop of blood. No battles were fought, no soldiers were deployed, no one even remembered it was still going on. This is the story of the war that lasted 335 years, a conflict between the Netherlands and a small group of islands off the coast of England called the Isles of Scilly. A war declared and then forgotten, until, over 3 centuries later, someone realized it was still officially unresolved. What happened? Why did it start? And how did one of the longest wars in human history become little more than a historical footnote? Let's go back to the 1600s, a time of kings, revolutions, and accidental wars. The year is 1651. England is in chaos. The country is torn apart by civil war. On one side, the royalists loyal to King Charles I. On the other, the parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell. The royalists had suffered defeat after defeat, and the king himself had been captured and executed. But a few strongholds remained loyal to the crown. One of them was the Isles of Scilly, a remote archipelago off the southwestern tip of England. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, the Dutch Republic watched these events with growing concern. The Netherlands was a rising maritime power, and it had a vested interest in protecting its merchant ships and trade routes. Dutch vessels had been attacked by royalist privateers operating from Scilly. To them, this wasn't just a distant English conflict. It was bad for business, so the Dutch decided to act. They didn't want war with England, but they did want to put pressure on the royalists in Scilly. And in one of the most peculiar moments in diplomatic history, they declared war on the Isles of Scilly. The Dutch fleet arrived off the coast of the Isles of Scilly in the spring of 1651. It was led by Admiral Martin Tromp, a name feared and respected across European waters. But this was not a full-scale invasion. Tromp wasn't there to conquer, he was there to make a statement. He demanded reparations for the Dutch ships attacked by royalist forces based on the islands, but the royalists refused. Isolated, defiant, and desperate, they had little left to lose. And so, on behalf of the Dutch Republic, Tromp declared war. But here's where it gets strange. Before a single shot could be fired, the parliamentarians, Cromwell's forces, marched into Scilly and forced the royalists to surrender. The very people the Dutch had declared war on were suddenly gone. With the royalist threat neutralized, the Dutch simply sailed home. The conflict had lasted a few weeks, maybe even just days. There were no battles, no negotiations, no treaty, and no casualties. But because there was no formal peace agreement, the war, technically, remained active. And then, the world forgot. For the next few centuries, no one mentioned the war, not the Dutch, not the British, not even the people living on the Isles of Scilly. Generations passed. Wars came and went. Napoleon, World War I, World War II. Empires collapsed. Borders shifted. But somewhere in the dusty archives of diplomatic history, one tiny war remained quietly unresolved. No one remembered that it had been declared. No one had bothered to end it. The Isles of Scilly, with their tranquil beaches and quiet villages, continued on as if nothing had ever happened, because in a way, nothing had. The war existed only on paper, a legal quirk, a forgotten footnote. It became a ghost of a conflict, a diplomatic echo from a time when monarchs clashed and fleets crossed the seas with cannons ready, and it stayed that way for over 300 years. Until one man, a local historian named Roy Duncan, stumbled across something strange. In the 1980s, Roy Duncan, a historian and chairman of the Isles of Scilly Council, was digging through archives when he uncovered a bizarre piece of information. The Dutch Republic had declared war on the Isles of Scilly, and no peace treaty had ever been signed. He was amused. Surely it was just a curious mistake, some lost paperwork from the 1600s. But technically, it meant that the islands were still at war with the Netherlands. Duncan contacted the Dutch embassy in London, explaining the situation with a mix of humour and historical curiosity. The Dutch, equally amused, took it seriously enough to respond formally. In April 1986, 335 years after the war had begun, Dutch ambassador Rein Heidekoper travelled to the Isles of Scilly. In a small ceremonial meeting, he signed a peace treaty with local officials. The war was officially over, not with a bang, not with surrender, but with a handshake and a smile. The longest war in history, 335 years long, had ended without a single shot fired. It's easy to laugh at a war that lasted 335 years without a single casualty. But behind the absurdity lies a fascinating truth about history. Sometimes what begins as a serious act of statecraft ends in pure irony. This forgotten war reminds us that diplomacy isn't always about treaties and power. Sometimes it's about paperwork lost in time, a declaration made in anger and never taken back. In a way, it's a symbol of how human affairs, even wars, can drift into irrelevance, surviving only in the margins of forgotten documents until someone stumbles upon them. But here's a fun twist. Even today, some historians debate whether the war was ever truly valid. Since the Isles of Scilly were part of England and not a sovereign nation, could a war really be declared against them alone? Others point out that the entire conflict may have been exaggerated over the years, romanticized, misunderstood, and passed down like a legend. But whether the war was real in the strictest sense, or just an odd diplomatic blunder, doesn't really matter, because now it has become a story of forgotten history, of unintended legacies, and of a war where nobody died, but everyone can laugh. And maybe, in a world often defined by conflict, that's the kind of war we should hear more about.